Welcome to episode 4 of the Savvy Skeptic Psychedelic Forum. You may be skeptical about psychedelics, but what about meditation? It's been around for thousands of years, and in the paper we examine today, Robin Carhart-Harris and his research group compare what we know about its effects to those of psychedelics. Rakesh, can you talk about the different kinds of meditation that are included in this review and what their benefits have been found to be?
I'll be happy to, Katya. And, meditation is a very old technique, 10,000 years at the very least. And you're completely right. There is great acceptance of meditation and its neurobiology and its helpfulness. And how interesting, we're going to talk about the overlap between these two very different styles of, of engaging with your mind. But I would say there are perhaps 4 or 5 very important styles of meditation that I think are germane to this conversation. Focused attention is easily the most common, where a person focuses primarily on the breath. So most people who learn how to meditate have learned that style. The other one is called open monitoring, which is without passing judgment, being aware of things. And then, of course, loving kindness meditation, which originated relatively recently, actually, in the Western world. And of course, mantra recitation, which, if you think about the 1960s and 70s, it became very, very popular. There is a great deal of evidence that these meditations really do enhance attention, focused attention. They improve mood. They improve, this is really important, Katya, they improve cognitive flexibility, enhance creativity, and most important of all, germane to this conversation, meditation has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to disrupt the sense of rigid self that we humans possess.
So that's very interesting. Let's dig in for a second into this idea of ego dissolution that many of these forms of meditation have in common, or really erasing the boundary between the self and the outside world and between the self and others. Um, Notably, this is a property that's also been noted with psychedelics. So can you talk a little bit about why ego dissolution as an experience for humans might be important?
So let's think about perhaps the two most common psychiatric disorders, depression and anxiety disorders. In many ways, they are the complete opposite of ego dissolution. They are, if anything, solidification of the ego excessively. So individuals with either one of those two disorders or both at the same time often become too ingrained in their own thoughts. They become very circular, the thoughts. They don't escape the system. They feed upon itself almost like a tornado does. So this notion of non-duality, this concept that I am me and here's the world, is in fact decreased in people who have these psychiatric disorders. It all becomes me, me, me. And that leads to challenges. So to your point, when someone has a looser relationship with their ego and the world, interestingly, the perception of depression as a mood or anxiety as a feeling is diminished. It's diminished not just from a psychological perspective, Katya. Not only do people report very quick onset improvement in the symptomatology, the neurobiological substrata demonstrates that this happens with meditation. And interestingly, with psychedelics also, because the default mode network, the hold of the default mode network is loosened. If that happens because we are not overfeeding the default mode network, then the symptomatology of these common psychiatric disorders is diminished. And I want to hasten to add that what I'm talking about isn't just an observable clinical outcome of meditation or psychedelic use. It actually has a pretty strong neurobiological substrata that shows how this actually can and does happen when the default mode network is shattered, even for a few moments at a time.
And let's just remind our listeners for a second about the default mode network. So this is a collection of brain areas that work together when the brain is at rest. They often involve mental time travel to the future or to the past, so ruminating or worrying about things. It's really what the brain does when it's not actively involved in experiencing the world directly in front of them. And what neuroimaging studies have found is that this network of areas that speak to each other quiets down with both meditation and psychedelic use, right?
It does. The default mode network is not our enemy. It's not our friend. It's neither, yet it's both. It's just that when we become depressed or we become anxious, the default mode network really takes over. It puts us into auto drive. The problem with auto drive is the end path to an auto drive vehicle is sadly depression and anxiety. And that's why this conversation, examination that you and I are doing of psychedelics and mindful meditation in particular, not done together, but done separately, the similarities between them are striking. There are differences. I want to be the first one to point that out. But the fact that both of these two techniques lead to a neurobiological change in the way the brain processes emotion and brain processes cognition, and the end result of that is improvement in mental health, should be profoundly intriguing, even to the greatest of all skeptics listening to us today.
I think that's a great point. And moreover, what I really enjoy about this paper is the detail and the care with which this group looks at this ego dissolution concept. So first, they propose a um, kind of two-dimensional model. And this looks at the narrative self, so your ideas of who you are, what you're doing, and the embodied self, which is what you feel, what you perceive in the world. So one of the models they propose is this two-dimensional model, and that losing your sense of self can be somewhere in that space between these two axes. But I think what really moves the field forward is that they then propose a multi-dimensional model that allows you to use a lot of nuance to compare both different types of meditation and different types of psychedelic experiences on different dimensions. So, for example, dimension of body ownership, body awareness, self-location in space, phenomenal richness, access to your own information about your autobiography, and then, of course, frequency of self-related thought. There's lots of different dimensions on which these experiences can be compared. So it really doesn't go in the direction of easy comparison and contrast. It's really multidimensional in nature. So what I wanted to ask you, Rakesh, is how do you think this multidimensional model helps us to compare and contrast the psychedelic experience and the meditation experience?
Yes, the similarities are obvious. The ego dissolution or the ego boundary loosening, the clinical benefits, those are obvious. What is not so obvious, which I appreciate you pointing out, are the dissimilarities. So the dimensionalities tend to be different. Now, what are we to do with this information? And I would point this out to our skeptics. If you are skeptical about psychedelics and ego dissolution and you have a cocked eyebrow about the whole issue, well, here's a good way for you to experience what ego loosening could mean by not using a psychedelic, but by picking up a meditation practice. And without a doubt, my patients who have been able to convince to try out mindfulness meditation, particularly for 4 to 6 weeks, they themselves report that I notice it. They then might be more intrigued by other ways of changing the consciousness. One of them could be breath work. Another one of them is chanting. In other words, there's no need for the savvy skeptic to automatically assume the only way to understand this issue about ego dissolution is by using a psychedelic. That's not necessary. There are many other ways to do that. But the take home message of this paper, which I agree with you, is very sober. And I think we're going to link in our notes to this paper so that people can read it for themselves, is that keep a very open mind. Be aware that psychedelics themselves, even without meditation, appear to do something that is profoundly interesting and replicable. And so does meditation, independent of psychedelics. So I suspect, Katya, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. In the future, we may actually have studies of looking at meditation and psychedelics combined. Would you be intrigued to see such a paper?
I would be very much intrigued because, in a sense, if you are opening your mind or if you're allowing for more possibilities, if you're taking away barriers to other forms of treatment, there could be radical synergy between the two approaches. I would be really interested to see what else opening your mind, quote unquote, whether it's through meditation or through psychedelics, can open the door to. But one thing I wanted to ask you, so in our past episodes, we've talked about the longer term
Mm.
consequences and benefits of psychedelic treatments. What can you tell me based on your experience with your patients on what are some of the longer term consequences of meditation? What are the benefits long term?
Yeah, and I think I'm a pretty good person to ask that question because I received formal training in mindfulness based cognitive therapy maybe 15 to 20 years ago. And I've really brought it into my clinical psychopharmacology practice. So I would say this: the less the mind wanders while under your control, meaning you really get to direct it, lower the chance of catastrophization. Lower the catastrophization, less anxiety, less risk for depression. Now, this is the clinical outcome, but the neurobiological underpinnings to it are really strong. When people pay attention on purpose, which, by the way, is what meditation is, paying attention non-judgmentally on purpose. Those are the three pillars of what mindfulness meditation is. Then the default mode network remarkably and very quickly shuts down. And when that does, that particular activity, the whole system becomes less rigid. So an individual then has more flow states. A flow state, by the way, is the ability to engage in pleasurable activities such as drawing or walking or having a conversation without your mind drifting. There's also good evidence that some of the higher psychological functioning, such as enhanced empathy, enhanced self-compassion, enhanced pro-social connectivity, are all enhanced in individuals who practice meditation. And one doesn't need to practice it for 25 years to get maximum benefit. Sure, it helps to have become a long-term meditator. There are plenty of studies looking at 6 to 8 week interventions that can show the positive results that I'm talking about.
Wow. So you can get all of that from meditating. That's absolutely fascinating.
It is not a surprise, is it, Katya, that every ancient tradition and every ancient religion, you name it,
Mhm.
will have meditative practices as a central core to them. So it's time, perhaps, in some ways, to go back to the future. But the
Mhm.
only thing is, back to the future is actually our past. We should really be examining the data on meditation much more closely for improved resilience against stressors, but also to gain greater wellness.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. And once again, I'd like to thank the savvy skeptics out there for joining us for this conversation. So stay tuned as we discuss results in our next episode of two important clinical trials of MDMA. Thank you.